So, hello, everyone. My name is Darius Taliūnas. I'm local. I'm from the Institute of History, and I'll be chairing this panel with two excellent speakers. And the first one will be Balázs Trenčany from the CU, earlier Budapest, now I understand Vienna. Balázs is one of the leading experts in the intellectual history and also the history of political ideas in East Central Europe. And one of his recent publications was a book, Crisis of Politics in the Interwar Period and Beyond, published by Oxford University Press. So Balázs, the floor is yours, please.
Thanks a lot. I hope after the lunch we are still more or less alive, and I hope I will not bore you to death with what I'm talking about. But basically I will take a little bit different, let's say, position than the previous talks, because I will still go back to, in a way, history of political thought or history of ideas, and try to see how these problems that we are talking about can be situated in some sort of historicization. Maybe it's a naive historicization, but I will try to give you some framework for this. And I would also reflect on this question of the compass that came up very nicely, that is not just spatial but temporal, and not just temporal but spatial in different renderings, and also about the question that Priya raised about bringing back context. So I will try to give you somehow a contextual reading of how basically synchronism or synchronization became an issue for East Central European political intellectual thought, and try to situate different debates on this axis somehow. And in this way it will be somehow a reading of discussions about political modernity throughout the last 200 years, but trying to focus on this concept. And I also try to bring it together with this book that Darius was also mentioning about concept of crisis. So in some ways I'm trying to see the relationship of crisis and synchronicity, and is there a kind of synchronization of crisis, and is there a crisification of synchronicity, and how does it look like in East Central Europe? And I think it's important to bear in mind that, in contrast to the previous discussions when we were talking about radical otherness or radical alterity, when you look at East Central Europe with the more or less Western toolkit, that it's uncanny in a different way. Yes, it's not this kind of, it's not the Mapuche discussion. Yes, it's not something that is extremely far. It's extremely hard to translate. It's the point is that there is a kind of permanent interaction. However, there are lots of kind of cognitive dissonances, that when you believe that you actually understand what the other is telling, or when you believe that you don't understand but you actually understand it. Yeah, but the conceptual categories can be very divergent, or sometimes very similar, but might mean completely different things. And then this kind of how to say politics of proximity is of course very crucial for what I'm going to talk about, this whole question of synchronization. Yes, because basically we are talking about political cultures or intellectual cultures that were constructing themselves to be somehow part of the West, but not quite. And this generated a certain kind of intellectual culture, and this of course goes back, I mean, in some ways it goes back to the early modern period as well. So like when a good Transylvanian traveler went to the Netherlands in the 16th century and described how, you know, book culture looks in the Netherlands, and then came back to Transylvania and wrote in his kind of diary that let's make a little Low Countries out of our country as well. So there was an understanding that there is a kind of difference, but of course it was not framed necessarily in temporal. It was framed in some sort of kind of cultural difference, but from the Enlightenment, from the late Enlightenment, basically from the emergence of conjunctural history, this spatial and temporal relationship becomes kind of somehow a chronotope, yes? That like because of the conjunctural histories, understanding that time and space can be translated into each other. So like if you have a distance in space, that can be translated into distance into time. You know, I mean, if a Maori is not just spatially distant from Paris, but he's also temporally distant, and you can understand ancient Greeks through the Maoris or through the American Indians, and you can understand Maoris through looking at Homeros. Yeah? So I mean, basically there is a convertibility of temporal and spatial difference. And basically in the 18th century that emerged for East Central European culture as well, because they were somehow part of this circulation. So like some Hungarian scholar at some point found once again about Transylvania that Montesquieu's book was in Cluj, Kolozsvár in 1 month. Yeah, so like after Montesquieu was published in Paris, in 1 month you could read it in Transylvania, and now you cannot read. I think François Hartog's book doesn't make it in 1 month to the same place. Yeah, so I mean, like, it's not that these were completely backwater intellectual discussions, but nevertheless they were from this temporal, spatial frame, like this conjunctural history frame, they realize that they are obviously not in the center. They are in some sort of semi-periphery, and this constructed a certain kind of intellectual discourse. And it's very important that in contrast to German criticism of imposed universalism, so to say, like kind of counter-enlightenment, East Central Europeans basically accepted this hierarchy. Yeah? So I mean, like a good Polish or a good Hungarian or a good Bohemian intellectual in the late 18th century didn't say that this universalism is imposed on us and that's why we reject it. They said that actually we have to internalize it and we have to kind of work hard to go higher in the scale. So actually they were overperforming this hierarchy. They were not contesting it usually. What's more, this kind of enlightened universalism, however, triggered particularism. Yes, so in order to kind of import universalism, you have to translate it into your own local culture, because we can only be part of the universal things if our society actually is able to follow it, and they cannot follow it in French because that will not work. So basically we have to translate the encyclopedia into Hungarian. Yes, so basically this kind of dialectics was a kind of founding experience for these elites, that we are kind of becoming part of, we are trying to overperform the Western script, but we can only overperform the Western script if we are constructing some sort of otherness from the West, because only through this kind of cultural vernacularization we can actually be part of the West. And that is a kind of tension that is from the very beginning there. And then basically this also leads to very interesting kind of political projects. For example, I mean, like those who do follow Enlightenment political thought, like Rousseau's Polish constitutional plan is which was co-written or basically dictated by Polish refugee kind of political emigres in Paris, who were basically convincing Rousseau to argue that although in the kind of French Enlightenment framework you have a certain kind of civic culture script that is the kind of normative script, for Poles they can only participate in it if they are actually preserving their past. Yeah, so I mean, like, you are not, in order to kind of be part of enlightened political culture, you can only be part of it if you are actually preserving something that doesn't fit the rationalist script. Yeah, so you are exactly irrational in order to be part of the global rational project. Now with Romanticism, of course, this gets even more complicated, but it's important, and Monika Bár, whom some of you, at least in Lithuania, know relatively well, because she was working on Lithuanian materials as well, she had a very compelling argument that romantic historiography in East Central Europe was very much carrying on the late Enlightenment conjunctural history. So like Göttingen school basically was formatting intellectual cultures from Poland to, or from Polish historiography to Hungarian and Lithuanian and all that, so from Lelevel to Palacky, and basically that was also a script that was very much this linear progress. So even if Romanticism came up with a different political style, rhetorical style, it was very much about, of course, spirit, or the different spirit than the enlightened spirit, but it remains still very much this kind of linear modernism. But at the same time you have a return to sacred time, and there is this kind of attempt to recreate synchronicity, not through this linear progress, but something else. And that's, of course, I mean, names that, again, some of you might have come across. Towiański, Polish kind of historiosophic construction, and then, in a way, his follower or his kind of intellectual interlocutor, Mickiewicz, like Polish poet, who has then impact on Michelet and French Romantic historiography as well, and they are basically talking about exactly belatedness or not being part of the Western core as a way of becoming part of the salvation story. And this kind of salvation story, this secularized or spiritualized, to a certain extent secularized salvation story, makes it possible to synchronize with the West or even overcome the West. Yes, I mean, like, it's actually Poles are the Christ of the nations, and they are actually, through their suffering, they are saving the whole of Europe. They are actually not belated, but actually ahead of time. They are ahead of time, not in this conjunctural history, but in this kind of history of salvation, a kind of like sacred history. So not chronos, but kairos in François Hartog's conceptualization. Now, with this kind of framework is quite important also in the revolutionary discourses like 1848 and around this, and also other intellectual projects which are trying to somehow construct this, in a way, secularizing this syncretic spiritualism that I was talking about, because like the revolution becomes this kind of moment of the sacré, yes, and it's not the salvation story, so they abandon completely the salvation story and they shift into the revolutionary kind of experience as a kind of moment of sublime, if you want, a kind of collective sublime. And this is true for quite a lot of these revolutionary discourses. So basically it becomes a synchronization in the revolutionary moment, and then it's sometimes so basically bringing in sacred time as a way to synchronize history, and in some ways it's an attempt to not even synchronize with the West, but overcome the West once again, that like we are able to kind of step into the future from our authentic past. Yeah? So I mean, like, this is a kind of discourse that tries to valorize pre-modern elements of equality, or so it's the kind of discourse that takes, like, this is the difference between the conjunctural story, which would be linear. Here the point is that there are some elements of our culture that are archaic and specific and communitarian, and these elements can be converted into a basis of a kind of collective future. So like, this is this elliptic romantic narrative that basically steps over the present, and then this basically kind of goes on. But then, of course, these romantic revolutionary projects fail mostly. And then you have a late romantic historiographical tradition. I mean, Poland is probably the most interesting, but you have something similar in Romania as well, which is basically bringing back atemporality. So it's not anymore this kind of jumping into sacred time or jumping into some sort of revolutionary sublime, but basically saying that there is historicity and there is an alternative atemporal existence, and you can shift between historicity and atemporality. So it's basically trying to synchronize not by overperforming the historical continuum, but basically stepping out of the historical continuum. And I'm stressing this because then this will come back, this late romantic modality will come back in the interwar period in this kind of national ontological projects. So if you read Mircea Eliade's texts or Émile Cioran before he became a French philosopher, or some of them drawing on Indian sources, some of them drawing on all kind of Orientalist discourses, this will be a kind of important modality. Now, I found a text like 1860s text about for example, Romanian poet Eminescu, who is talking about that. On the one hand, there is historical backwardness of our society, and that should be preserved because like it carries some authenticity. But in reality, history doesn't matter because actually there is a moment of eternity into which you can opt out from history. So there is a way to opt out from history altogether. Now, in contrast to this kind of romantic tradition, there is a criticism of the romantic transcendence of history, both the revolutionary and this conservative transcendence, that is basically coming with the positivist episteme, and then it's basically trying to respond to the crisis of this synchronist romantic synchronism, and tries to kind of go back to some sort of, once again, conjunctural model. Yes, that there has to be some sort of authenticity that is step by step built up, and we should be realistic. We shouldn't overstep. There is no way to overstep certain kind of civilizational kind of stages, but we have to kind of be organic. Yes, I mean there has to be an organic development, and this is quite again strong in some contexts, and here basically it's almost impossible to synchronize. Yes, I mean like it's very, I mean like synchronization basically is that working hard, and maybe in the future we will synchronize, but we don't know really how it is possible because we clearly have a huge gap, and we should be, as I said, basically realistic. We should just work like they have this conceptualization of organic work or drobná práce, like small work. So like basically we just have to concentrate on small things. So this is basically the kind of late 19th century discourse, and then these might go together. For example, in the case of Masaryk, like Czech intellectual whom you might know as a politician, but before he became a kind of president, he was a kind of quite important political thinker, and he is putting this positivist discourse into an even more radical perspective, and he says that basically the past doesn't matter. Yes, I mean like the past is only, I mean it's basically what you were talking about, that the past is some sort of vortex, and we are in the present, and from the present we are constructing for ourselves certain kind of past. So the past matters as a political legitimization, but it doesn't talk to us. We are talking to the past, basically, and this is a kind of radical, if you want, early modernist construction of the past, and it's also kind of a debate with the historicist cult of the past that would tell that there is some sort of kind of inherent continuity. Now, in the early 20th century, you have a kind of pluralization of this discussion. Of course, you have basically three modalities, like you have the modernist intellectual projects, like aesthetic projects, which are kind of believing that, again, different contexts are a little bit different, but like some of them are somehow returning to the romantic. So like, for example, Polish modernist project is to a certain extent rehabilitating against the positivist, against this organicist positivist. They rehabilitate the romantic temporality, and they say that there is some sort of transcendental element that you can kind of go back, and art is actually creating this possibility of overcoming basically the kind of positivist understanding of linear, boring linear kind of progress. In some other cases, it's not so much neo-romantic, but there is definitely a kind of saturation with this kind of positivist modality. Then you have a similar political discourse, but not on the left, because these modernist projects are somehow more politically on the left. But you can have integral nationalist projects, which will be very important once again in the interwar period, but they are there at the turn of the century. And they are also basically trying to synchronize with the Western nation state model. So they are saying that in order to kind of make our country normal, we have to actually have homogeneous nation states. And it's true that unfortunately we have heterogeneous imperial spaces, so we have to kind of speed up this process. And of course the implication is basically genocide, yes, but I mean of course they don't say, they just say that it's the mobilization of the national spirit. It is about kind of recapturing vital energies of the nation, but basically the synchronization here means actually creating homogeneous ethnic communities. And then you have also populist projects, which are kind of socialist and populist projects. I mean, the mainstream Eastern European social democratic discourse is very much rooted in this positivist frame. So they are taking seriously this leg of development that I was talking about. Then, I mean, so much so that many of the socialists in East Central Europe at some point say that if we take seriously that we have to go step by step, like we are reading Marx, and then Marx told us that, you have to reach all the stages in order to go to socialism, then for us we need to first create bourgeoisie, because we don't have bourgeoisie, and in order to synchronize with the West, first we have to have capitalism. We can't have socialism. So first we basically have to build capitalism. So some of them actually say that then why are we in the Socialist Party? Then we should actually, in order to synchronize with the West, first we should be in the Liberal Party, and then they actually exit. Romanian socialists actually exit the Romanian Socialist Party and enter the Liberal Party, because they say that first, let's do capitalism, and then when capitalism will be overcome, then at some point we will do socialism. And then you have the populists who are negating this linear perspective, and who are saying that basically there are no identical patterns of development, and you can jump. And you probably know that there is this interesting conversation of Marx and Verasasulich, so like in the Russian translation of The Capital, and this is a kind of moment when this discussion starts. But then it's Central European populists kind of make very complex intellectual projects out of this in the early 20th century and in the interwar period. And basically they are kind of saying that we don't believe in this linear developmentalism, and there is a way to basically preserve pre-modern structures and build on these pre-modern structures social collective, futural collectivist projects. Yes, I mean, you don't have to go through atomization and individualization, but you actually can create socialism from pre-modern structures. Now, in the interwar period, these traditions continue, but they radicalize. Actually, this is the period when, I mean, there is one Romanian thinker called Lovinescu who actually even writes a theory of synchronization. So there is even a reflection of, the book is called Synchronism, and it's an attempt to kind of think through the conceptually what it means to synchronize with the West. And he's a liberal, and he's kind of arguing, he's taking Gabriel Tard's theory of imitation, like so French sociological discussion, and he tries to translate it into the Romanian context and says that imitation is a way to catch up. Yes, that because the imitator is always imitating the best practice. Yes, I mean, imitation is not it's not copying, it's not reproducing the temporal lag, it's basically fast-forwarding modernization. Yes, like basically he describes what Japanese kind of elites were thinking about in that period. And it's very, very interesting that he's basically doing this against this kind of positivist criticism of kind of non-organic development. So this is a liberal criticism of the positivist organism. But the funny thing is that this is more or less true. So he's describing it as a sociological theory. And it is actually true that when you look at East Central European elites, because the positivist criticism was about that why do we have opera if we don't have audience? Why do we have, kind of national theater if we don't have a single person who writes plays? I mean, first we should have village schools. We should kind of teach the, common people to, be alphabetize the society, and then in 50 years we can have an opera. Yes, and then the liberals were arguing that no, we should have the opera, and this Lovinescu also argues that we should have the opera, and at some point the opera will create its own audience. Like people will first imitate, they will just behave like snobs, they will just go there, they don't understand what's going on, and at some point, this culture will produce its own indigenous modernity. And the funny thing is that this is actually more or less true for the early 20th century sociologically. So there are, for Eastern Europe, that there are all these kind of Western institutions which are in the beginning kind of little bit dysfunctional or funny or like not really fitting the purpose. And at some point there is a kind of urbanization, a certain kind of level of middle class culture entering these spaces. And by the early 20th century, you have basically avant-garde cultural magazines. So like you have everything that you would have in the West. When a Japanese avant-garde magazine in the 1920s creates this kind of, map of European avant-garde, then, of course, it has the style and it has French Dadaism and whatever, but it has Romanian journal included, Polish journal included, Hungarian journal like Lajos Kassák, and all these guys are basically on the map. Yes, so I mean, from the perspective of a Japanese avant-gardist activist in the 1920s, Europe is already a kind of synchronized Europe. There is no such a thing that Paris is because like in the mid-19th century, if the same Japanese would write about art, then he would say that everything that is interesting happens in Paris. Yes, I mean like there, maybe something in Vienna, maybe something in Munich, but everything is concentric. But by the interwar period, there is a real synchronization of cultural life. But then, of course, for the interesting thing is that these avant-gardists who are actually part of this, don't read this synchronist discourse, because at that point they are already heavily anti-liberal and heavily anti-modernist. So basically the Yugoslav modernists in the 1920s who are picking up this avant-gardist discourse, they are saying that exactly our pre-modern archaic features are interesting for the avant-garde. It's not our imitation of the West. So you understand the twist, yes? That basically synchronization happens in a moment when people are ideologically desynchronizing. So factually, So the synchronization technically happens in a moment when people are ideologically desynchronizing. So there is a kind of, and I think this is true for places like Argentina as well. I think that like in the moment when, so Borges and people like that are kind of catching up into an intellectual culture that is kind of transnational, there is a kind of rejection of European modernity as the only script. Yes, but and this creates a very interesting and very specific dynamic later on, and I will just go there in a second. That exactly in the this will become a very strong imprint in the cultures, in East Central European cultures, that will have a very interesting impact after the 1989 as well. That the most prestigious moment of intellectual synchronization with the West is happening in a context when people are actually rejecting the West. Yes, so and this is like, I mean, Romania was my favorite example, that in the 1990s, if you went to Romania, then every child wanted to, every secondary school child pupil who went to the bookshop wanted to read Eliade. Yes, because Eliade was the only one whom they recognized as internationally recognized Romanian intellectual. Now, if you read what Eliade wrote in the 1930s, basically he was writing that, you know, we are finally stepping out of historicist culture because there is a possibility to actually exit from history, and this exiting from history creates a chance for non-historical nations like Romanians to be part of global civilization, but this part of global civilization is going through basically totalitarian mobilization. Yes, so basically this kind of model becomes, this comes in the 1920s from the avant-garde, from the, if you want, leftist avant-garde. So Yugoslav avant-gardists in the 1920s who are part of global conversation, and they are reading futurism and all possible other kind of things. They are starting to talk about the barbarogenius. Yes, like that actually avant-garde is compatible with with barbarism, with archaism, and then you are not trying, that your kind of stepping out of history is not forward, but backward, basically. Which is like funny with avant-garde, yes, that like it's an avant-garde temporality that is actually retrograde. And then this creates one more twist, and then of course in the early 20s you still have a kind of European intellectual pressure, which we tend to forget, and in my book on crisis I was writing quite a lot about this, that in the early 20s there is a relatively strong liberal consensus in Europe. Yes, I mean it's not, of course, if you ask Italians or Hungarians, they don't necessarily share it, but there seems to be only one game in town. If you asked in 1922 what is the kind of official ideology of European, and this is connected, of course, post-war peace framework, Wilsonism and whatever, there is a kind of very strong pressure on Eastern European states to look like liberal democracies. Yes, there is a kind of normalization of liberal democracy as the only ideological alternative. It's very strange for us because it very quickly evaporates. So like 25, 26, you have the coup d'etat in Lithuania, in Poland and all that. And by the late 20s, as you probably know, there is only one Eastern Central European country that is not a dictatorship, and that is Czechoslovakia. Yeah? So like basically in 8 years, from this homogeneous liberal democratic consensus, we shift to homogeneous anti-liberal consensus. But there is a moment when this liberal consensus is strong, and this liberal consensus is legitimized with the discourse of zeitgeist. Yeah, so basically liberals are saying that, you know, I mean, like it's everywhere, that's the only script. So it's like there is no alternative, so to say. So we have to be liberal democrats as well. And then, and this looks a very good argument, yes, like basically using zeitgeist as the kind of legitimization of why we should shift to a certain politics. But then with the late 20s, this zeitgeist, I was kind of writing in this text that the Wunderwaffe turns against the liberals, because with the late 20s, it exactly becomes the other way around, that if the normative West is anti-liberal, then how can you be liberal in the periphery if your whole ideology is about catching up? Yes, so basically liberals whose political script was about catching up basically fall into this trap that if your whole discourse is about catching up and it turns out that the most advanced West is not liberal democratic anymore, then you cannot remain liberal democratic. And this basically delegitimizes in a very successful way and very brutal way the East Central European liberal projects. And then there is one more twist in the story, is that how can you contest, and of course you have basically what I talked about, this radical anti-modernist projects like Eglė and others, where crisis of European modernity is the chance of synchronization. So exactly because European modernity collapses, you can valorize your archaic traditions, and you can valorize this opportunity of the peasant culture to be atemporal, So I mean, like basically you can be counter-hegemonic and at the same time ahead of times as well. So this is the radical project. But then, very interestingly, if the liberals cannot contest the totalitarianism because they are basically believing that the zeitgeist is the normative framework and the zeitgeist shifted. The radical anti-modernists are anyhow radical anti-modernists. There is a very interesting niche, and this is again something that is usually forgotten, that the only intellectually successful temporal argument for anti-totalitarianism is actually a conservative argument. That basically to argue that you have to be asynchronic with the West. That we are, for example, to argue that we are not that advanced yet to have a crisis. And this is actually what many of the Eastern European, so for example, Eastern European reception of Spengler, and we have colleagues who worked on it, was very much arguing that, of course, Spengler, like decline of the West is very relevant for the West, but in Eastern Europe there is no decline because we are not that advanced to have a crisis. Yeah? So basically to kind of turn the kind of Western decline discourse against itself, and basically to argue that we are exactly our asynchronism with the West gives us some chance not to become totalitarian, because if we are synchronic with the West, then we become totalitarian. Yes, and then to make it even funnier, then some of these guys are, of course, reading, for example, Britain as asynchronic with Western modernity as well, and this converges, of course, with some of the Ernest Barker and other British intellectuals in the interwar period who are also playing out this fact that British culture is kind of anachronistic. Yes, that our democracy is not hyper-modern, but exactly exactly a kind of like gentlemanly asynchrony with continental Europe's radical totalitarian turn. Yeah? So, and then basically there is this kind of Anglophilia for Eastern European intellectuals who are reading England as a kind of asynchronic, in a way, to a certain extent, belated modernity compared to the hardcore modernity of Germany. It's also very important to bear in mind that for Germans, of course, Germany is not Western Europe, but for Eastern Europeans, Germany is paradigmatically Western Europe. Yeah? So I mean, like it's usually hard for Western Europeans to understand this whole spacing of the West for East Central Europeans, because the East Central European discourse is always taking the Germans as the paradigmatic West, whereas German ideological discourse was, of course, always saying that the West is more to the West from us. So basically, I'm now stopping and just want to recall once again that these traditions then created very many very interesting modalities, and I don't have time to kind of personalize and contextualize it even further. But then this had very complex impact after the Second World War. Of course, the 1960s, basically post-56, so post-Stalinist temporalities were also very much about synchronization. So like if you look at Khrushchevian understanding of catching up, and then basically East Central European reform communist projects of catching up, it's very much about basically trying to synchronize with the West. It accepts that, even Khrushchev accepts that currently the West is more ahead, just he is kind of sure that in one lifetime Soviet Union will catch up. Like, of course, reform communist intellectuals were not that sure that it will be a catching up, but they were taking the Western modernity as, again, basically one systemic framework. So if you want kind of going back to some sort of possibility of synchronization. And then again, it's a very interesting moment that it's exactly 1968 is the moment which is the crisis of this convergence, yes, but at the same time it's hyper-convergence, yes. I mean, like 68 is a moment of revolution, student movements, both in Eastern Europe and Western Europe. There is a certain kind of moment of synchronization in terms of looking at each other, following each other's models, whatever. but at the same time we also know that it's a kind of radical desynchronization, because like actually how it plays out in the two contexts is very different. And then 1989 is again a moment of synchronization. So it's, of course, there is a moment when it looks like that actually the Eastern European temporality disappears, and there is one homogeneous temporality which melts into this Fukuyama-esque understanding of kind of ideological hegemony of Western modernity. And that looks fairly convincing for Eastern European elites, exactly because it was corresponding to this logic of catching up, except for then when it collapses, then once again we are back to what I tried to describe about the interwar period, that if the zeitgeist changes, then this kind of catching up becomes a kind of opportunity to catch up with anti-illiberalism. And then of course, what you get in the last 10, 20 years is in a way returning to these modalities of kind of trying to avoid or trying to exit this competition by actually retrotopic constructions and basically constructing normative pasts as kind of futures for Europe. And I mean, making not only America great again, but Hungary great again is, of course, a project exactly along these lines. And I mean, I would just like to finish with maybe some minimal optimism that I think what we see, however, if you take this longue durée, then that neither this radical retrotopic, nor this radical avant-garde, nor the conservative, nor the liberal projects are disappearing for good. Yes. So now we, like a couple of years ago, we had this understanding in Hungary, and I think in all Eastern Europe as well, that basically the kind of radical anti-modernist discourse is basically erasing all the other modalities. And I think what we see even in Hungary, but also if you go to Belgrade and many other places, is that, and for me, of course, Ukraine in this respect is the most important experience, that there is a certain kind of struggle to recover the future. And this is, you know, Serbian students on the streets who are fighting basically every day to restore some sort of autonomy for their schools. Hungarian, you know, intellectual networks and political networks that are trying to preserve civil society against, and Ukrainian society that is fighting basically for its own future and for the future of Europe. So there is some sort of kind of possibility, I think, to create crisis, not just as a kind of debilitating or a kind of moment of paralysis, but also as an opportunity to rethink basically your own position and to try to kind of think about your own temporal positionality and kind of think about the past and the future and recreate some sort of relationship between the past and the future. And it's very important, and it's of course very complicated, that all the three cases like Hungary and Serbia and Ukraine are actually, for our taste, sometimes surprisingly reverting to national symbols. So the anti-totalitarian or anti-authoritarian projects are actually, you know, using national flags, which for a very long time was disturbing for the external observers, sometimes the internal observers. I mean, for me, it was also strange that in Budapest, all of a sudden, I see national symbols all the time. But then I realized that it is actually the only way to contest these kind of authoritarian projects. You cannot contest them if you are just saying that you are happy transnational actors who are happy to connect transnationally. You have to actually recover the past from this authoritarian project. So my kind of modest proposal here is just to think about these kind of contemporary contestations also in terms of this longue durée histories of catching up and losing and synchronization and asynchronicity, and also the many, many modalities that are available for us. In some ways, the vortex from which we are not choosing only cynically and only instrumentally, but we have to still have a relationship with this kind of churning things, and we have to have our, if you want, snapshots with which we can create some sort of political symbolism with which we can contest authoritarian projects. So, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Balázs, for this nice longue durée overview. And before I open the floor for serious questions, I have a couple of simple or naive ones. One is about the mental maps, about your own mental map and the mental maps of your protagonists. What is the East Central Europe in this case? And my second question is about what is the main trigger for the changes in paradigms? I wonder whether I understood you correctly that this is zeitgeist that is the main trigger for the paradigm change, or that is a simplification of your presentation.
Yeah, so for the mental maps, like we were working quite a lot on this, and I had a edited volume also about this concept of European regions, basically conceptual history of European regions in this series of Michael Frieden and some other colleagues who are here, and we were trying to argue very much that, of course, historical regions are heuristic concepts. So, I mean, I don't try to argue that there is such a thing as East Central Europe. I just think that for this presentation, there is a certain kind of mental map that I can use for you to understand more or less what I'm talking about. And for example, I was not talking about Greece, which in some context could be part of this story. In other contexts, it wouldn't be part of the story. And I was also not talking about, let's say, Ottoman Empire or Russia, which in some ways it would be part of this story, and in other ways not. So I think, like, I just want to make sure that it doesn't sound like that I'm trying to make a kind of normative argument about where Eastern Europeans ends, whether or Central Europe, is Vilnius, still part or not, or like is Baroque or is Gothic architecture defining where? No, I don't believe in this. I think in different historical and academic discourses, we are actually spacing Europe differently, and Blue Banana is also a valid geographical unit of analysis if you want to see, I don't know, urban patterns of European hyper neoliberal industrial hubs, but then it would be a different type of heuristic than what I'm doing now. As for the other question, like what creates this kind of moments of intensification? I mean, I was using zeitgeist as reported speech, yes? So I mean, like, this was the discourse of many of the actors. So I mean, they learned it in the 19th century, there is such a thing as zeitgeist, and they used it as a legitimatory construct. But I think my own understanding is that basically what happens is that you have elites, cultural elites, which are heavily integrated into Western European intellectual circulation. So, like, basically, everything is more or less not symmetric or not synchronic, but it comes relatively quickly. So, like, I don't know, basically every paradigm, Western European paradigm comes over. But the social context is not the same. Yeah, so basically you have liberals without urban middle class, or definitely without indigenous urban middle class. You have socialism without proletariat, and you have all these intellectual transfers which are basically coming with complex intellectual work, but very little or sometimes not at all connected to the social context to which they are actually referring to. And what you have then is some, and this creates basically symbolic capital, because these guys are participating in all international not conferences, but activities. And then basically what you have is that there are some historical moments when all of a sudden the social and political context actually speeds up. So like 1848, 1860s, 1918, all of a sudden there are real collective crisis experiences that are somehow pushing these societies into something that is actually puts together lots of possibilities. And for a very short time, these intellectual elites, who are actually well-versed in these transnational conversations, are becoming the main actors of this transition. Yes, like this is 89, this is 1918, this is 1814. And then what happens is that actually, since they are only having symbolic capital, but they are not actually socially and politically and financially the elites, they very quickly lose this power. So what you have is usually a kind of very quick shifts from, in a way, pre-crisis, crisis, and post-crisis situations, when in the crisis moment, these kind of westernized elites are extremely well-placed to be the leaders, but then the B elites, like kind of indigenous elites, which are kind of contesting this highly westernized elites, are actually hacking these transition processes. And then basically this creates this very interesting, and I think 1989 is a very paradigmatic case for this for most of East Central Europeans, that like you have basically these populist backlashes are actually not happening first time in these societies. These are actually happening in every similar situation, because basically these cultural, westernized cultural elites don't have the social capital and political and financial capital to basically control the transition. So they are only good for actually bringing in they are only good to bring in the constitutional court, but they are not good to bring in capitalism, yes? And then basically by the time capitalism comes in, they are losing their positions to a certain extent. So I think my feeling is that that creates a certain kind of very interesting, if you want, tension in the logic of these societies, that you have all the time kind of clash between these transfer elites in a way and kind of local elites which are kind of contesting these transfers. And that's why I'm saying that zeitgeist is not good, because zeitgeist would be homogenizing this. But the whole point is that these are cleavages that are all the time reproduced in this society.
Thank you. So I see here, please, Mike. Please raise your hands if you have other questions.
Thank you. That was a very thorough recap of such a long history. Thank you. I wanted to ask about racism and racial thinking. I think we should have it on the table. I'm thinking about, just to link back to my question on the previous session, one thing that lets people, this Enlightenment idea of history as progress and time as unilinear, one thing that lets that take such hold, such imaginative hold, and lets historians and philosophers write about the history of other places and see Eastern Europe as Western Europe's past and so forth, is a racial view, right? Like, you don't have to look at the context for explanation. The reason why these places are past is self-evident, is proven by race, right? And vice versa. What proves that history is progress is racial thinking, right? They work together. And so I was curious if you could say something about how those perceptions mattered in this in the view of East Central Europe as a periphery, and especially in that very critical early moment in the Enlightenment era when Eastern European intellectual elites deeply and seemingly permanently internalize this idea, right? They, as you said, they accept this view that they are on the periphery. And I would just be very curious to hear how race and the racialization of Eastern Europeans from the Western perspective
this is a super interesting question. And now, of course, there's much more sensitivity to so, like 5 years ago, anybody who comes from East Central Europe would have said that there was not such a thing. Yes, that like there was no conceptual or any reflection on race, because these were not colonial societies in any way. So basically, and now there is a more nuanced perspective. I don't know, James Mark has a new book about this and stuff like that, so there is more sensitivity. But I still think that this kind of othering of Eastern Europe in the 18th century was very quickly translated by both sides, both by the Westerners and the local elites, as cultural rather than racial. So because there was always an opportunity to basically racially other your own peripheries. So basically the racial differentiation became not East versus West, but how the Eastern elites could actually racialize their own internal peripheries. Yes, so because they didn't have colonial peripheries, so like there was nothing to, but there was also an Orientalist element, so like you could actually valorize your Orientality as kind of positive. So there was a kind of negotiation between this kind of positive and negative correlations to compare to Orientalization. But in the end, basically they were saying that, Bulgarians are kind of belated, but they are kind of white Europeans. Yes, so and that created more or less an opportunity of a much more malleable relationship. But then it also is very important that there is basically, what Western European elites were doing with their colonial subjects. Eastern European too. I mean, where your ends was a constant negotiation. Yeah, but I mean they were. Yeah, but I mean, like basically, more or less, because of Russia, it becomes somehow beyond the issue of East Central Europeans. There's nobody who claims that the difference between Serbs and Croats is racial. Yes, I mean they might say that we are Central Europe and you are Eastern Europe, you are Balkans, we are civilized, but nobody would say that you are actually a darker race or something like that. I mean, like racially they cannot really conceptualize it too much. I mean, it becomes more cultural, religious, so other markers are more important. I mean, that's what I wanted to say. Where the racialization comes in is basically two kind of ethnic communities who are excluded and included in different ways, in different contexts, Jews and Roma. I mean, Tatars are, I mean, like that's in relatively small story here, but yeah. And then of course, basically there is what I wanted to say is that there is a kind of like self-colonization discourse which actually turns the local rural societies as basically almost racially other. So like when in the interwar period you have French exhibitions where they bring colonial subjects and exhibit them in the zoo or in the World Exhibition, like they bring a village of Caledonian indigenous population and put them into the French colonial exhibition. The Romanians do this with the Romanian village. Yes, in Bucharest, they bring the Romanian peasants, the Romanian elites bring their own peasants and exhibit them in the exhibition the same ways as the French were exhibiting the Caledonians. Yes, so there is basically a kind of similar othering, but it's actually racially, it's very hard to racialize it because it's not exactly racial. It's some sort of kind of anthropological othering, but not racial.
Can I just correct you? Because even in the case of racialization of, say, people in the Middle East or certain peoples in northern India, it's not exactly about race and culture and these things.
Sure, it overlaps, but it's still rooted. Sure. Yeah, but it's still rooted in anthropological theory, anthropological meta theory, and in most of these cases, this discourse is not so much rooted in anthropological meta theories. They don't produce anthropological, epistemic frames for othering. They use it rather in this kind of culturalist way, and at the same time, basically, race is a completely ski word in the late 19th century in political discourse, but it basically means more nation. So when I read 19th century text, then Hungarian text, then every sentence of a 19th century liberal, he will use race, but it basically means nation. It doesn't translate into racial categories, actually. So he says Hungarian race and Serbian race, but he basically means Hungarian nation and Serbian nation. So it's very complicated to translate exactly the Western categories. And at the same time, and that's also very interesting, just to give one more layer to it, there is actually an anti-colonial discourse, which is a self-assumed discourse of most of these elites. Now I was reading quite a lot of Ukrainian texts. I mean, basically Ukrainian texts from the early 19th century onwards, they are talking about themselves as being colonized. And they compare themselves to the American Indians, to the Irish, to all possible kind of communities. And it is a kind of racial theory, but it's a self-descriptive theory of being the colonized and not the colonizer. Yeah? So there is even more extra twist in the story.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Among the many things that fascinated me was this idea of single historical events or period that can trigger or, provoke or facilitate some synchronization, at least within the European context. You mentioned 1968 and 1989. So I was wondering, can you read through these lenses the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022? And do you think it's more of a synchronizing moment or desynchronizing moment? Because I can see how it synchronized, let's say, Western and Central Eastern Europe in terms of speeding up the process of moving towards the West in those countries that are bordering or close to Russia. But at the same time, we can see a divide between those societies. And maybe it's more like a northern, southern European divide, meaning that some societies in Europe are forced by this cucumbersome neighbor to still have a perception of history as something that is still ongoing, and they have this perception of war as something that can still happen in our societies, while certain nations, or at least some parts of their societies, especially in Western and Southern Europe, reject this completely.
I mean, it's a fantastic question, because I wanted to finish exactly with this, but then I thought that I spared the audience of another 3 minutes of argument, because I am also very much divided, and divided exactly the way you are telling. I wanted to tell that when the full-scale invasion started, and we were, like, every day we had Ukrainian families in our flat, yeah? So, like, my wife was going to the railway station and was picking families, and they were sleeping with us, and we were trying to direct them to different places, and we had, like, hundreds of Budapest friends who were doing it, although the government was, of course, basically making it, I mean, it didn't punish it, but it basically made it very complicated. And then I had all the Polish friends who were doing the same, all the Czech friends, and so we existed in a kind of synchronization which was transnational. And then I went to a conference in Florence. It was like April, May, early May. And in Florence, I had a feeling that nobody understood that there is a war. So I was talking to people like, friends, acquaintances, whatever. Factually, they knew. I mean, like, they read it in the press, and then when they watched between two football matches in the bar, there was still like a 5-minute news that, something was bombarded and Kyiv is kind of, surrounded and whatever. But, like, nobody had this feeling in Italy that there is a war that is touching them, So... And my friends were like completely like those friends who kind of traveled to Italy had the same stories. But I think now, after 3 years, we have a certain kind of synchronization. Now, I think at least part of the European elites understand that this is, to a certain extent, Europe's war. Yes, and I mean, like, there is a certain, I mean, like, because of Trump, I think Trump, to a certain extent, synchronized European elites. So my feeling is that there is a certain kind of moment of synchronization. Of course, Hungary is a hyper outlier. Like, the Hungarian government is basically it's agents of KGB, so I mean, like, it's FSB, but I mean, there is a kind of European synchronization, but this is a European synchronization that touches political elites, and if you ask Polish voters in Bydgoszcz, then they are not sure that this is their war, yes? And I mean, Nawrocki's votes partially came from people who were actually thinking that, leave us alone. So it's also a tricky question of whom does it include and whom it doesn't include. And I think it's true for the other synchronizations that I was talking about. 1848 was a very mass event in Budapest because at least 500 students were demonstrating against the Habsburg Emperor, So, like, we are talking about elite events, even when we talk about mass events. And this is true, I think, for all these contexts. So I would be very careful not to project this synchronization to the whole society as a whole, but at the same time, it still means that it includes people who are traditionally not thinking about these things. So, like, these kind of crisis situations, and that's why these crisis situations have a certain power, because they really mobilize people who are whose horizons of expectation are normally not extending to political agency. Yes, all of a sudden people become politically active who are not normally politically active. And this was even true in Budapest in 2022, yes, that people who would normally not do anything were actually going to the railway station. Not every Hungarian, but more than you would imagine. Yes? Even in a country where there was official anti-Ukrainian propaganda. So I still think that it changed somehow some people's mentality, but I mean, how far it is sustainable and where does it turn into political agency, it depends on also, of course, on the kind of macro context. And I'm also thinking that there is also this anti-modern synchronization. Yeah? So basically we have parallel synchronizations, if you want, because you have also this kind of radical conservative synchronization, like now basically like the Millet text that you were telling, I could have translated it into Hungarian and I would have recognized it as a text of Orban, yes? And I could have translated it into Russian, then it would have been a text of Medvedev or Putin. So I mean, like, it's basically complete. I mean, there was not a single element in what you read that I didn't recognize. Yes, it's completely as if it was just AI generated and circulating among these politics. There was nothing urgent. There was nothing, or any Polish radical, right? And so there is a kind of hypersynchronization of this discourse as well. So yeah, I think it's a very interesting question.
Okay, and the very last question goes here. Wait for a while.
So you'll forgive me, I'm a naive American, but it is, I'm curious, my question is really on your story, what drives the interest in synchronization? Why do people go to Paris and say, I don't give a damn what's happening there. I'm perfectly happy what's happening in Budapest or Bucharest or, wherever. I mean, really what's missing to my ear from this story is, who cared? Where does the drive to emulate, who designates an elite and from whence the drive? I mean, it's not just not in the air or the rain or something. What on your story is the engine here?
Well, I mean, I think it's still very much due to the fact that with all the kind of complexities, most of these cultures were still part of the, still European cultural circulation even before, yes? So, I mean, there is a certain kind of sensitivity to be part of certain dialogues. Of course, in the 18th century, there is a paradigm shift, but, in the 16th century, 17th century, elites from Polish culture or Czech culture or Hungarian culture, they were part of this dialogue anyhow. So for them, it is not colonial modernity once again. It is basically some sort of kind of familiarity which triggers a certain kind of feeling of, participatory drive. Yes, that you want to be part of it. But of course. Well, I mean, it's power in a complicated way because I mean they are actually in this logic they are only losers. Yes, I mean there is no real gain from it. I mean they would gain more if they would exactly say that we don't care. Well, I mean it's. I mean it's.
The Meridian conference took place at the end of the 18th century.
I think we have. Yeah, excuse me. They are making recording, and maybe we stop this discussion at the moment. Although it's interesting, and we can go on, but we have another presenter, so maybe it's time to thank Balázs. Oh, you would like to finish something?
Well, I mean, I just wanted to say that yes, indeed, power is one of the elements, but I wouldn't reduce it to. So I wouldn't reduce it to symbolic power of the people who are actually doing this transfer. I mean, it is, I think, a more complicated. As I said, it's also about cultural transfer. It's also about familiarity. It's also about actually being part of the educational systems. Anyhow, Western educational system, so basically it's the local elites are anyhow sending their kids out. So I mean there is a certain kind of cultural competition to be part of this dialogue. And then it's also, I think, important that this is the way they imagine that they can actually put their cultures on the map. Yes, that only if you are a qualified interlocutor, you can actually valorize the society you come from. Yes, if you are not able to speak French, then nobody will understand that you are a Polish nobleman. Yes, I mean then nobody cares for a Polish nobleman. Polish nobleman has to be part of this dialogue if he wants to kind of. And I there is just to show the power disbalance, in very shortly. I mean there is a very beautiful story about a Hungarian nobleman who becomes a correspondent of Voltaire. And he's writing to Voltaire and he says that I read your latest work and I'm really fascinated and let me send you my poems in French and I'm sending also a couple of bottles of wine that I produce in my, noble estate. Answer was that, dear friend, I very much like your letter and the wine was very good. No mention about the enlightened poems that the guy sent, but for him, of course, the enlightened poetry was important. Yes, and his understanding was that he's part of an intellectual dialogue with Voltaire. Voltaire couldn't care less for this intellectual dialogue, but for the locals, it mattered that we are part of, a kind of European circulation. It's a Republic of the Letters. Yes, I mean and these kind of constructions were creating a certain kind of, in a way, captive audience. From the 18th century onwards, that you want to be part of the dialogue, because otherwise you don't exist. If I can't speak to you in English, you will not consider that I can have anything to offer to you. I mean, it's basically that.
Okay, I think it's time to thank Balázs for his paper. And now it's time to introduce the second speaker in this panel, Eglė Rindzevičiūtė. Although we know each other for more than 20 years, I still got a note how to introduce Eglė. And it says associate professor at Kingston University, and that's wrong, because she recently was promoted to full professor. Our congratulations, Eglė. And she's well known in Lithuania and beyond. She's an expert in cultural history, sociology, criminology, and many other topics. And one of your last publications was a book, The Will to Predict, Orchestrating the Future Through Science, published by Cornell University Press. Eglė, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your generous introduction. And is this microphone close enough? It seems like it is. Good. So thank you very much, Balázs, for this exciting tour de force through synchronization. I'm going to touch upon synchronization as well, but slightly from a slightly different perspective in my talk. But first, I wanted to thank Zoltan and Aurimas for having me here. I'm really learning a lot. I'm not a real historian, as you might have sensed, but I'm certainly interested in theory of history and historiography, so it's a great pleasure to be here. I would like to dedicate this talk to Barbara Czernewska, a scholar with whom some of you might be familiar. Barbara was a brilliant social scientist. She was born in Poland, but only because of the population displacement from Vilnius region during the Second World War, as all her family are from Vilnius for many, many generations. Barbara was one of the pioneers of a truly post-human approach that merged social sciences and humanities through the actor network theory, the famous Bruno Latour's application of another Lithuanian's Grimas's narratology to study social and material relations. And to that, one of the many Barbara's contributions is the concept of action nets, and I wonder if we will explore it through this convention, where Barbara argues that actions always precede actors. And it is on the basis of the chains of actions that the actors acquire their identities, stabilize them, and form networks. And today it seems that the entire generation of courageously innovative scholars is going away. So Bruno Latour died in 2022, and just a few weeks ago we lost Michel Calon, and Barbara as well last year. Although we were not historians, the work was attuned to the study of the past in its rich ethnographic detail. And so my own work has been strongly influenced by ant and action nets thinking, as I combine historical sociology and STS. And I believe that these perspectives are especially helpful for the understanding how ideas and actions intertwine into nets that configure the future. And so in this talk I will explore the idea of scientific prediction, the use of scientific methods and expertise to make claims about future events or unknown events, or chains of consequences. And this is based on my long-standing interest in the history of computers, cybernetics, and systems thinking, particularly the work which I did as part of the European Research Council research project FuturePol, which was led by Jenny Anderson at Sciences Po in Paris a few years ago. And so Jenny's idea was to do an intellectual and political history of future-making methods, rather than to study the more traditional notions of future ideologies or cultural models of future or time. And so this very particular focus has been really formative for my thinking. But I took my thinking in a rather different direction. So in my previous book, The Power of Systems, I tracked the history of East-West understood in terms of a Cold War notion. East-West co-production of global governance through computer modeling of long-term phenomena. So a form of computer-mediated future-making across the boundaries of political and geographical regimes. However, after the end of Future Pole, and I moved to London from Paris, I was left dissatisfied, as I felt that not enough attention was paid within the project to the category of prediction, the meaning of which was considered sort of self-evident. And when I really scoured the historiographies of prediction of future making, and I couldn't find a book that would satisfy my curiosity. And that I thought was not quite right. And so I addressed that feeling in my last book, The Will to Predict. And when writing that book, on the one hand, I tried to track the development of a scientific prediction in the Western context and also in the Soviet context. But when finalizing that book, I ended up asking increasingly normative questions, as the previous speakers covered that question. That's probably why we do history, after all. So is it possible at all to improve human capability to create cognitive and behavioral frameworks of prediction? And more importantly so, how can we cope with the failures of scientific predictions, especially us being scholars? Can the intellectual, social, and political history of scientific prediction help us here? Like Americans like to ask in conferences, what can we learn from history? So I did wonder what indeed. Right, so although it can be suggested, and it has been suggested, that today we, and here I think we is the global we, live in the age of prediction, where anticipation is in high demand, the role of scientific predictions in the uncertain world is far from being clear. To use Černiavska's term, there is an overflow of predictive statements made by humans or algorithms, many of which contradict each other and most of which fail. Major events that led to social and political volatility, such as Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but also the cases of disruptive political leaders such as Donald Trump, have prompted debate about the limits of predictive expertise. If bad things are predicted, why they are not stopped, just how bad can be. So there is this kind of thinking that there is a lot of prediction and it's somehow useless. And sometimes these leaders behave unpredictably and sometimes they are predictably, but no one is better off for that. So scholars have approached predictability, as you know, in many different ways. One is the idea that there is a sort of social dynamics which is somehow regular and perhaps it could be predicted, so that is embraced by some social scientists. One interesting scholar here is the US modeler Peter Turchin. He is of Russian origin, coming from the prominent Moscow dissident family. Had all his career in the United States. So Turchin claims, as many of us, of course, to have predicted the election of Trump before it happened, on a basis of his model that tracks the process of overproduction of elite population. So Turchin comes from a population ecology point of view. So he's a natural scientist and computer modeler who recently began to engage with a cliodynamics approach to history. And he wants to revive history as a data-based system science. So what does he do in his books or research? He argues that the growing number of elites in combination with wealth extraction from the population leads to excessive competition. So the population of elites grow too large, like, you know, in case of fruit flies or wolves or deer, you tell me. And so you get an increasingly large number of wealthy elites fighting for a small number of political power positions. And so in this fight, elites use strategies of polarization, they destabilize the political system, and they further exacerbate destabilization through ongoing wealth extraction. And that in the end leads to violent conflict and possible system collapse. So basically now Turchin is predicting civil war in the United States, unsurprisingly, as Trump won the second term. So what's interesting and what makes Turchin's argument somewhat different is that he claims that it is based on actual science of history. So he has worked with historians and produced a computer model of the history of the United States, but also looking globally, where he tracks that this cycle of overproduction of elites, immiseration and collapse is very regular, has been fairly regular during the last 2,000 years. As you see in these graphs, and so we can expect in the future systemic collapse despite those progressive narratives since the 19th century, or despite of liberal democracy. In turn, Turchin argues that this dynamics is not kind of written in stone. It can be regulated by principally welfare policies to reduce the number of super elites by limiting the wealth extraction and redistributing profits, sending them to, surprise, surprise, universities. Okay, so that's Turchin, and we can discuss that later. So his work is situated, I argue, in a very particular context of statistical forecasting and large systems dynamics modeling, but that's not the only type of database prediction that is being made. So for instance, digital techno-optimists, they hail the rise of machine learning applications who know nothing about nothing, but they can diagnose change and predict all sorts of patterns that are somehow coupled to what is really going on in economy and society. So AI may soon predict financial crisis before they take root. Will it admit that it has caused financial crisis? That's a different question. If you ask several times, it might. It is also hoped that computer-based predictions will lead to better policy decisions, climate. At the same time, further evidence mounts that failure of AI-based prediction tools actually fail. There was a kind of huge popularity of AI-based predictive policing, especially in the US, but now that all has been shown not to work at all. Okay. So let us move closer to academic scholarship again. So economic historians such as Deirdre McCloskey have long argued that economic predictions are not much more reliable than the ancient arts of divination. So McCloskey would see all this techno-hype about digital applications and AI applications as part of the long Western cultural tradition of dealing with future uncertainty. So economic forecasts, wrote McCloskey, are part of Western anticipatory culture with pre-scientific roots. They cause a lot of enthusiasm, but in order to be prudent, one should, quote, expect little and trust them not. It's interesting, though, that McCloskey identifies the predictive power of forecasts with accurate representation of a phenomena in question, which in my view is also a limited view of how diverse predictions work. Another influential piece of work, and more recent, is one by the influential German sociologist Jens Beckert, who also critiqued statistical forecasting, arguing that, on the one hand, the future states of the world are not predictable, and describing economic predictions as a form of imaginary or fiction, but which is shared by finance professionals as part of the internal culture. And Beckert, as many anthropologists and ethnographers of finance, argues that the actual financial decision-making is better described as a socially driven phenomenon, attempt to conform with a group behavior of fellow professionals and using those predictions as a kind of stabilizing device, as a form of cultural communication. So what I'm getting at here, kind of to show that there are these kind of scientific predictions, there are technological processes that can do prediction, and there are social, scientific, and historical critiques of those predictions. And it seems that a lot of critical scholarship are taking stance against scientific prediction, which is associated with all sorts of evils in the world, from capitalism to positivism, and so on and so forth. However, I think that this is still not quite full picture. And I think there is more to predictive knowledge and scientific predictions than McCloskey and Beckert bother to allow. So prediction, I argue, is not limited to foretelling the future. I think predictions work when they work. They work even when they fail, and it is important that they fail, especially if they make a claim to be scientific. They work by orchestrating knowledge and action through synchronization. So in my book, The Will to Predict, I try to demonstrate precisely this kind of history of writing when you focus on the idea of prediction and try to discern its diverse functions. And what I will do now in the remaining of my talk, I will present several examples from the European history of predictive sciences. Again, my specialism is the Cold War and mainly East-West, but I will be talking about Greco-Romans and, God forgive, the 19th century, so that's all based on secondary sources. So my goal is not to bring new primary sources into the debate, but rather to bring a new locus of historical analysis. And what I hope to do is to show that there is this richness and huge interest in focusing on the notion of scientific prediction, and that can help thinking about how to write the history of the future. Okay. So I would like to start with American economist Frank Knight, who authored the extremely influential concept of risk assessment as the only rational way of coping with the future. While noting that humans cannot fully predict or know the future with certainty, because, as Knight put it, quote, we know so little, and by that he meant economists. Knight argued that it is necessary to foster a forward-looking mentality and to make inferences from routine observations in order to get the grip with the social and economic development. And to do so for Knight was not only an intellectual pursuit necessary for the survival of companies or economies, national economies, but for him it was actually key cognitive feature of a human being. So for him, the theorization of risk, attempts to make predictions, involved a humble existential position. And as many will probably agree with me, many economists, especially macroeconomists, are anything but humble. So Knight was speaking to them. So it is the modern imperative to predict, but one has to be humble about it. Lots of histories now have been published looking at this kind of forward-looking attempts to rationalize, to make sciences of prediction and to put those sciences into political, social, and cultural context. And that's why I situate my discussion as well, particularly Jenny Anderson's work. Okay, so Knight, of course, was not the first. Traditional story of European scientific prediction, of course, goes to the roots of what is the normal mainstream European science, so ancient Greeks and Romans. And there are wonderful histories now written about divination and prediction in the Roman thought. It's really interesting. So in the Greco-Roman model, the human ability to foretell the future was divided into two different zones. So it depends on what is being foretold. So the future could only be fully known by gods, but it could also be made by gods. But some elements of reality could even be known by humans. So as the historian Federico Sant'Angelo, who I believe is Italian, showed in his excellent study of ancient Roman divination and prediction, the categorization of reality represented this hierarchy of knowledge. So the most certain mode of human knowledge was called scientia, which would focus on laws and causes that govern the physical world, but only that part of physical world which is either fairly unchangeable or very regular. So for instance, like planetary motion and astronomy, numbers and mathematics, and space and geometry. However, the other parts of human reality, such as weather, political events, wars, and health, are characterized by cumulative, fast changes and highly irregular forms. So these could not be known with certainty. They could be known by gods, but not fully by humans. But humans could approach those forms of changing reality through mantic knowledge, which studied science, not laws, so a kind of semiotics of change, and produce conjectures rather than truths. So in this kind of model of knowledge, predictions were immediately a second-rate form of knowledge, imperfect, less reliable than scientia, but necessary to survive in the changing environment. What is really interesting is that it was in the Middle Ages when predictions of irregular, fast-changing events have begun to be absorbed into some branches of scientia, and eventually were distanced from classical mantic knowledges. So such expertise as hydromancy, chiromancy, astrology were rendered at the end of the Middle Ages as non-scientific, whilst other forms of knowledge like medicine entered the canon of modern science. So there is this wonderful Catalan historian Alexander Fedora who was studying how medieval physicians drew on prediction to create the model of diagnosis and prognosis, which was originally proposed by Hippocrates. So medicine was, in the Middle Ages, was still defined as scientia conjecturalis, so no laws, just science. It studied fleeting signs, that means signs that both changed and could be changed. By identifying symptoms and, most importantly, continually tracking the rate of change. So the way how the signs were changing, the temporality was equally important as the category or the meaning of a sign. So many illnesses were mysterious, but some illnesses were recognized as regular, and yet individual bodies were quite unruly. They responded to illness and treatment so differently. So treating them required a very particular epistemological engagement, constant observation and adjustment of inferences. And this is where medicine began to or medical prognosis began to diverge from astrology. So astrological model of prognosis is based on global predictions where future events are totally determined a priori by planetary constellations. And any kind of mediating events are not particularly important. They are nice to know, but they are not crucial because they only mediate the predestination. And so it is precisely this focus on the initial predetermination that eventually pushed out astrology from the ranks of modern science, according to Fedora. But in medicine, and what we now recognize as modern science, transitional events are most important. And the failure of prediction is important because it becomes a point of information that monitoring, that diagnosis, that further knowledge and explanatory framework has to be developed in relation to the changing reality. And I don't know if everyone can see this picture of that person with a jug and a crown. So this is a doctor holding a sample of urine, trying to track symptoms and make a better diagnosis. So apparently, these medical persons with urine samples is a common feature in the illuminated manuscripts. Okay, however, it was not the romantic version of prediction that McCloskey and Beckert critiqued. They actually targeted not medical prognosis. I'm sure we went to doctors happily, although McCloskey probably not always. We targeted positivist models of prediction as a form of governmental planning, which was famously proposed by the French sociologist and positivist Auguste Comte. So now, according to Comte, the ability to predict correctly is the ultimate marker of the quality of scientific theory. So I'm kind of making these points, how prediction first is accepted as imperfect but necessary knowledge, then it gets developed, and then it inserts itself into the core of what it means to do proper science in the European modernity. So Comte argues now that the very purpose of modern science is to generate predictions on the basis of laws, so it would be a contradiction in terms for Greeks and Romans, and to guide governmental action. So scientific knowledge generates prediction, which informs action. And if prediction fails, Comte argues, that means that the scientific theory is wrong or underdeveloped. So prediction failure now tests robustness of science. And so this model would be adopted by logical positivists. It would permeate the epistemology of many applied sciences. And in public discourses, when public today are expecting scientists or scholars, experts to make predictions, they're still using this Comtean model. However, and unfortunately for Comte, for the next 100 years, the development of applied policy sciences mainly focused on statistical mapping of complex phenomena and not predictions. So it's the accumulation of data through censuses, through weather maps, and that's because there was not enough data to do complex predictions about society. Although the mathematical equations already existed as early as the 18th century, for instance, by Eglė and others. So, but they would get to be used only in the mid-20th century. So it's really, really interesting, this asynchronicity of expectations of predictive power of science and making actual scientific predictions. Okay, I have to speed up now a little bit. So explicit concern with social and economic prediction appeared in the second half of the 19th century and the early 20th century in response to rapid industrialization and fast quick and boom and crash processes. As well as expansion of the governmental institutions engaged in large infrastructural projects and management of urban population growth. So interest in forecasting economic trends was particularly urgent in the United States and Great Britain, where major collapses of rail and oil extraction industries, as well as nascent insurance society, created this interest into boom and bust. But as I said, it was only by the 1920s that just about enough statistical data was accumulated and economists embarked on testing mathematical models to plot trends. And this is why we have Knight, who calls for the economists to be humble. So these trends, attempts to predict future trends, is done in the institutions, the so-called economic barometers, in New York, Cambridge, Paris, Germany, and Moscow. So some of those economists were indeed humble. They argued that the economic predictions should be treated as hypotheses at best, experiments more likely. There was this debate about predictability and governability of the economy. Some economists considered prediction failures normal, just because the data was still incomplete and the economy was so complex. But others really wanted to improve statistical forecasting in order to streamline the planning of public infrastructure, and then with the onset of the Second World War, to manage logistics and to ensure population survival. So this is where predictive science really comes in. Do I have 5 minutes? Yeah, good. Okay, so I hope that I show how this expectation from science to do predictions and about the future is coming into shape. But it was after the Second World War and during the Cold War and during the focus on post-war recovery and large-scale infrastructural planning that scientific predictions became paramount. So both communist and Western Bloc governments required expert forecasting to steer very complex capital investments and to shape societal development. More data whenever was available, and starting with the 60s, there were increasingly powerful computers to crunch it. And it is precisely at this moment, probably like 150 years since Comte wrote his Science Prediction Action, that this model appeared to be finally within the reach of both state and corporate planners. However, as it has turned out, decision makers got more than they bargained for. So the first long-range global forecast of the world future was published by the US scientists Dennis and Donella Meadows, who together with Jay Forrester ran a computer simulation to explore the impacts of industrialization and pollution on world population. And as many of you know, the resulting report, The Limits to Growth, predicted exhaustion of natural resources, decline of public health, and collapse of world economy in 2030, so in 5 years. 4 maybe. The model was criticized along the same lines as the early economic cycle models in the 1920s, that the data was still incomplete and the complexity was still too high to make such certain statements. However, the Limits to Growth inspired international collaborations to develop computer-based modeling at the United Nations and other international research institutes, and led to the emergence of Earth system science, one of the largest research areas that seek to anticipate and predict complex system change and to intervene in it. And at the same time, when the successful implementation of this Comtean model of prediction was appearing, an entirely different approach, which actually reminded strongly a form of mantic knowledge, emerged, and that was cybernetics, or the science of control through informational feedback loops, proposed by the US mathematician Norbert Wiener in 1948. So cybernetics targeted not large, long-term, and slow evolutionary changes. It didn't deal with big data sets. Cyberneticians, like medieval physicians, were interested in very fast-changing, disorderly, perhaps even unknowable phenomena and mistakes. Incoming missiles, illnesses that caused overshoots and random erroneous movements, such as Parkinson, and also non-thinking behavior, or what was considered non-thinking behavior by robots or animals who seem to automatically adjust to the changes in the environment. So just a few examples about the cybernetic self-regulation through adaptation. The famous turtles designed by the British psychologist, cybernetician Gray Walters. So kind of like now everyone has that turtle, also known as automatic Hoover, but that's the 1950s. These turtles were also exhibited in the ICA, Institute of Contemporary Art in London, where they're kind of running around. You see there's a suggestion not to feed them. Any kind of prosthetic devices was also another area to design automatic predictive processes that would couple human body with artificial devices. And then also very interesting attempts were created in the urban planning, foregrounding the development for self-driving cars. So again, car doesn't know anything about the city, but thanks through very high frequency predictions, perhaps it can orientate itself and take people safely from point A to B. Okay, and this is where I will start wrapping up. So what are we to make of scientific prediction? Are we a necessary positivist evil? Are we all the same? I hope to have showed that no, that there is a lot to learn from the history of scientific prediction, both in terms about how different predictions can be, how scientific predictions differentiate themselves from other cultural and social models of anticipation, how predictions in different forms of science also differ quite fundamentally. But to me, as a cultural and social historian of sorts, I am interested in the performative role of predictions as they synchronize actions, how they support transition from the known to an unknown event, how they also enable to behave, to get along in the uncertain world through continuous failure and adjustment. I also think there is so much more to learn about the heterogeneity of predictive epistemologies, and this is where I really liked the paper about non-Western modes, because actually a lot of non-Western models of engaging with uncertainty did inform cybernetic thinking. And I'm also very much interested to learn more about how scientific predictions are intertwined with local cultures and practices, how they are adopted and developed outside of the major centers of great powers. So I will finish by saying that maybe in order to understand future, to write the history of the future, and to think about history as a science of the future, it would make sense to focus on prediction as a locus of analysis. And this, I argue, would place intellectual history at the center of behavioral sciences of complexity.
Thank you, Eglė. Now we have about 20 minutes for Q&A session. So please raise your hands. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much, Eglė. I have one question which a bit relates actually to Balázs's presentation as well, because it's about synchronicity. And again, especially as known what is going on today, not necessarily scientific prediction, but also in algorithmic prediction. But again, algorithmic prediction becomes scientific prediction and so forth. So the two, of course, also hang together very, very, very tightly and increasingly tightly. So, and you were also mentioning synchronization in a way, but do you think that's a sort of this, as to the speaking to the current moment, the sort of predictive activities or algorithmic scientific prediction can be a sort of a super synchronizer in a way in terms of societal developments in different parts of across the globe? Or do you ever, or have you ever encountered ambitions to elevate scientific prediction into such super synchronizer, either in the Cold War or in more contemporary times?
Yeah, thank you very much, Simon. That's Zoltan. That's really very good question. So I had to kind of skip a few moments where I wanted to expand on synchronization in my talk. So thank you very much for this question. Yeah, so the very point, synchronization is absolutely key for the notion of prediction if it claims to be scientific. So remember, I was kind of referring to the medical prognosis. So it's no good, if a patient goes to see the doctor and doctor is like an astrologist, says, "Oh, I think that you have the pneumonia. Here is the medicine. Go away. I treat you." Good doctor would follow through if the symptoms are not changing, if the treatment is working. So it would synchronize the claim, the guess, the estimate of what it is and how it will develop in the future with continuous observation and, when necessary, intervention. Okay? So prediction is always... So this is the Western model of what it takes to do scientific prediction. Scientific prediction is the one which is applied to changing environment through the process of synchronization. Okay? Where you have very high degree of certainty and you have very established theories and laws, there is no need to prediction. The causalities are known. There is certainty of knowledge. So that's what I try to show in the book. There is a little bit, so the term of prediction is in the common language, is associated often with the judgment of certainty. So I predict something will happen. When people say that, others understand them that we know for sure that something has happened, or we know, or maybe there is a probability, but we know it. And it can be known. So scientific prediction is already based, it's already processual. There has to be a process of adjustment because the limitation of knowledge is at the core of the notion of scientific prediction. The astrologers, we know for sure what will happen. That's why we are not scientific. Scientists, when we predict, we don't know for sure, but we launch the process of further investigation. And that further investigation and response to failure is what prediction is. So it is a process, not a singular decision or judgment of fact, so to speak, from the philosophy of science. Now, when you insert this kind of processual process of making of scientific prediction making in the decision process, then it becomes synchronized. That's why you have to develop these special organizational or technological models to have this continuous loop of informational flow. And that works at certain level of complexity, this form of synchronization, but not on other levels of complexity. So for instance, where you have very fast change, and you have ability to exchange information very fast, let's say within a small group of management, you can have this kind of cybernetic system where you synchronize collective action through exchanging predictions, and in this way making also all the participants predictable. But if you have a very large complexity, very large number of actors, and possibly large distances, like in national economies, so then economic forecasting becomes, it's very hard to synchronize them into the management of economy because there is a lag, there is no synchronicity in real sense. And this is what both Beckert and McCloskey noticed when we were critiquing financial and economic forecasting, that these forecasts do not participate in the economic reality in a meaningful way, so people shouldn't believe them. But I argue that these forecasts do not participate in economic reality effectively, not because they are wrong. Most of predictions are wrong, but they can be very effective, but because of impossibility to synchronize that particular form of expertise with the high complexity of economic development. So synchronization will depend on the level of complexity. And I think this is where the art of prediction comes in. How do you pick proper predictive methodologies to proper level of complexity?
One question about the connection in a way between prediction and agency, yes? Because if you are doing, I don't know, biological experiment or I don't know, chemical, then it's very unlikely that you want to, act upon your object of experiment. But when you are doing, for example, in the 1970s, this kind of cybernetic kind of predictions, then many of the people became dissidents, yes, because they actually calculated certain kind of predictions about the future of socialist economy, and they started to say that there's no reason to sustain this system, and you start to have basically actors like all the Czech transition was basically implemented by these futurologists. Yeah, so I wanted to ask this: to what extent it's different to predict as hard science and different to predict this kind of thing, even economists. Yes, I mean, if you are an economic predictor and you are predicting that there will be a crisis, does it mean that then you have to do something, or you are just actually predicting and say that you go for holidays? And then the other implication of this is that are there some moments when this kind of paradigm of prediction is shifting within even closer range than what you are, because like you temporalize it in this kind of big chunks. But for example, we have Rüdiger Graf wrote us an article in this project of Politics of Time about 1970s in terms of the politicization of risk as a category. Yes, that like risk is like in Knight and all these things that you quote. I mean, risk is not a political category. I mean, yet. I mean, it has more economic implications and whatever. But then in the 1970s, basically, risk becomes actually the central category of politics. And I mean, we have Risikogesellschaft and all that. Yes, since then. And now, basically, his argument is that actually we are completely surrounded by risk, as that risk is actually a central concept of political legitimization in the 21st century. So do you see this kind of paradigm shifts in your own story as well, if we are kind of working not with this very big longue durée construction, but let's say about the second half of the 20th century, and what do we have now, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. So just very quickly, so the agency of prediction is really, really interesting. It will depend on the type of prediction. So I really would like to use the plural verb there. So for example, economic forecasting or financial forecasting, we have the agency, for instance, of self-fulfilling prophecy. So they might be completely wrong, but if people act on them, like Robert Merton wrote, they will enact, for example, the collapse of a bank. If everyone goes and withdraws the money, yeah, that's it. So was the forecast right? No, it was actually, it had agency, because the power of forecasting in this case is to provoke action. Yeah, so it's very performative. Then there is this kind of logical positivist prediction which can be about the future, about events that didn't happen, or it could be about data which is not found. And this is how many statistical models are working, and this is how predictions work as part of science. So it works more as a test. What interests me is the cybernetic prediction, because this is, on the one hand, it is extremely short term, so it's more like a mechanism of using prediction as part of action, where minimum informational processing takes place. But I'm getting tired now. So the point with cybernetic prediction is that information that circulates is not representational. It is part of agency. And this is how robotics work. This is how informational signaling works. And the very point of the cybernetic system is not to find out the truth, is to survive. So these little robots or animals, we are not interested in the metaphysical universe and what are the laws of the universe, but we want to not to discharge, if that's the program goal, or to survive, or to catch a mice. So there's this very strong pragmatic framework. And the interesting bit happens when you start applying cybernetic model to collective behavior. So this is where the predictability as mutual predictability as synchronizing device, which builds trust or collaboration between different actors, which underpins the emergence of a social. And that was the important political agential idea of cybernetics. About the politicization of risk. So my argument is that a focus of prediction should actually be as big as risk studies. And what's interesting about risk, so I'm particularly thinking about Power's book about organizing risk, is that it leads to a fairly bureaucratic mentality of managing risk and reducing risk, which is fragmenting and has all sorts of impacts on individual agents. Meanwhile, I argue that cybernetic predictability has a very different political effect, because it assumes lack of transparency, and it promotes the idea of cohabitation, collaboration, and survival in the context of incomplete information. It's kind of groping in the dark, like Donella Meadows wrote. So in the 1960s and 70s, when cybernetics was introduced in the communist background, it was actually embraced by many dissidents and liberal inclined thinkers, because the very idea of non-transparency and of self-regulation had strong liberal connotations. So there was this very interesting moment of politicization.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I have a question about AI. I don't know, I read an interview a couple of months ago with two people who organized a think tank about what AI will do to us. And yeah, they were quite convinced, we're talking about that as well, that there are two scenarios, a worst case scenario and a better one. And by 2029 or latest 2032, AI will reach human capacity of, I don't know, reasoning maybe, or even exceed it and take over production, and this will be very difficult times for us. And when talking with people about this development, well, I often find myself like pinned to the question, or in the discussion, what does it mean to be a human? Like, what will AI change? Or what will it mean to us as humans? Will we have to do the boring work, and AI will be creative because humans are very predictable? Or will we be able to do the creative work and maybe AI will do the bureaucracy, hopefully. And the discussion here is not about fast changing, let's say, phenomena, symptoms, but something that is a very old question. What are we? What does it mean to be human? So I'm just interested what synchronicity could do about these very big and essential questions, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really, really important problem area. I think what I can respond to this is that that's why it's so incredibly interesting to look into the history of scientific prediction, and particularly cybernetic predictions. Because when the first computers were produced in the 1950s, 60s, there was specifically the debate about if these machines, who seem to generate, numbers, texts, images, sounds, move around some servo mechanisms. If these machines are intelligent, what's left for humans? And the answer was found fairly quickly, saying, well, what we are doing are the fairly mechanic, routine forms of the aspect of human intelligence. Okay, so computer is a big calculation machine, so it's like a big calculator, it can count more. Okay, there is this robotics, it seems to be efficient, but it works only in a very limited context. And human brain and human collectives are these like super formations that are much more flexible, universal, and can do just so much more than that. So that was an interesting answer. At that time, there wasn't much debate about so-called AI. There was machine learning going on, but because computer power was so low, the applications were mainly disappointing. So it was only in the 90s when the processing power improved that machine learning began to show some kind of results, which we have now. So to me, the interesting moment is about technology participating in the wider context, and this is why synchronization is. So if I were to hypothesize myself, I would say what would be left human to do if the intelligent technology goes and becomes really quite good, which at the moment it really is not, we have to say. So is to synchronize it into societies so that societies achieve their own goals. it's very unlikely, if I may say so, that any form of technology will do synchronization on its own behalf by way of engaging other actors, coordinating them, making connections, establishing goals. So it's an interesting idea and maybe something to work for, but yeah. But that's how debate goes. So basically, everything that has got to do with structure, with context in which technology works, is so incredibly complex, changing and changeable, that no discrete technology like those algorithms, there is no risk that we will be able to engage with that changing context in any meaningful sense.
Okay, thank you. Very last question, as before. Here.
Thank you. That was so interesting. I was just to get us to the theme of the directionless time. I was just going to ask if you could, off the cuff even, just help us theorize a little bit. What do you mean by the future, and what is the difference between the future and a future event? Because I think there might be a little bit of an apples and oranges issue where when you're talking about how ancient people thought about prediction, their concept of the future and of time is so different. They're, to what Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment people are thinking. So if you could just theorize a little more for us what you mean by the future, what these people meant versus what you might mean, which might be different from your figures.
Thank you. That's absolutely brilliant question. So I'm interested in how predictions historically have been articulated, defined, and used in the social and organizational and political context, right? What drove me to study, to focus on prediction, is that I think that prediction is the key process and concept that people use to produce stuff, and that stuff could be time, future, or whatever. What is really interesting is that when you look at different types of scientific predictions, they produce, I would say, they are tools with which people produce temporalities and different lengths of temporalities. And with those tools, people also establish absence or presence of facts, okay? So that's future or past or whatever. So what I mean by that? So for instance, the limits to growth. It's a very interesting the limits to growth report of 1972. It was a very interesting report because the exercise was to put in a very fairly causal model, how pollution and resource extraction affects health and economic development, and then to run the model for as long as it, so that to sequence the chain, so that it produces something interesting. And then at some point, the computer model will stop because it will run out of power, or the data will be, it will kind of eat itself. It will become nonsense. Okay? So the fact that that model established the point of collapse at 2030 was not predetermined by the modelists. We didn't come and say, oh, let's see what will happen in 2030. We said, let's run the model and see what it shows. And that model produced this timeline that then became part of policy context. Okay, so there is like 100 years and or was it 70 years now? 70 years and the resource will be resource and world economic collapse. So this is one attempt to kind of run prediction as a causal chain, produced that particular timeline for the policy imagination. When you look, for example, at self-driving car, it uses very high frequency predictions, like continuously. These are fractions, nanoseconds. And that's the temporality it makes. And this is just two examples. And that's, to me, that's super interesting, how these different predictions produce precisely those different temporalities and how they have been articulated and translated in different intellectual, political, cultural agendas. Yeah?
Thank you. Yeah, because I think you can have prediction even without a sense of a distant future. I'm thinking of like MBT, the African philosopher, talking about East African religions and temporalities, where there's obviously prediction, but it's based on past events, giving you a power to predict what will become the past. There's no distant future. There's only the not as yet revealed past. It's a little different, but there's still this cyclic, within a cycle you can predict without there being a concept of a moving towards some other future, if that makes sense. Anyway,
Yeah.
this is so super interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is also interesting work on Chinese traditional take on predictions, which is quite different from Greco-Roman model as well.
Okay, thank you, Eglė. I still see a couple of hands raised, but unfortunately the time came for coffee break. So thank you again for both of you. And now we have 25 minutes break.